Food security is absolutely essential because the first thing that a human being needs other than air is food. And that provides a foundation for their ability to grow and be productive individuals. If they're malnourished, that affects the development of their intellectual capabilities, and that affects them the rest of their lives. And so I think that really the basis for having a productive community starts with having adequate nutrition that is also readily available and accessible and guaranteed over time, so that the population is not anxious on whether they will eat or not. If a community feels that it doesn't have to worry about whether they will have food or not, it creates a certain level of stability in that community, because they are guaranteed they can move on to doing other things like going to school without having to worry whether they will have a meal in the evening or not. And so kids are likely to perform better at school if they are not worrying about whether they will have a meal to eat. And so I think that food security has more than just the nutritional content, but also the psychological security that it gives to a community. If you have a productive community, a community that is basically has adequate access to nutrition, that community will also have the ability and the energy to produce more food, but also to diversify the activities into other economic areas. And by doing that, they will generate enough revenue, and that revenue can then go into stimulating economic production, which feeds back into subsequent economic and agricultural production. So it's a virtuous cycle where one supports the other. I think the first step for Africa being able to address its current food crisis is recognizing that it has abundant arable land, but this land is not in production, mostly because of lack of adequate infrastructure. So I think that the first step in expanding Africa's food security is going through expansion of rural infrastructure particularly. And the second part has to do with a scientific and technological input that enables farmers basically to have access to new varieties and new technologies. And the third one has to do with agricultural input. There are many other parts of the continent where they have arable land, they have good seed, but they don't have access to fertilizer or pesticides. So those three areas, which have to do with infrastructure, technical input, and fertilizers and seed and pesticides, I think these are absolutely essential. I don't see Africa being able to feed itself without investments in those three areas. Actually, I would argue that if you don't have infrastructure, you won't have markets, because markets are about moving goods, services, and ideas. And to move goods, services, and ideas, you need transportation networks. Secondly, you need communication channels. And thirdly, you need the ability to store produce and process it. And all those are really linked to four critical areas of agricultural production, which is transportation, energy, telecommunication, and irrigation. So you won't have markets if you don't have infrastructure. But you can have infrastructure without markets. That's why you get into questions about entrepreneurship and training farmers to act as entrepreneurs. But I think the key prerequisite for having markets is infrastructure. There are two ways of thinking about that question of climate change. I actually think that the first step is just ecological degradation that is not linked to climate change at all. And this has been going on. For example, when you have a drought, you end up with shifts in the ecology that very often would wipe out, say, traditional varieties, and then farmers have to breed new crops from scratch because they had a drought. So I think that the first step is thinking about just ecological degradation, which could also arise from overuse of land or natural disasters like floods that change the ecology and wipe out previous varieties. And then the longer term challenge is climate change, which basically adds to instability and lack of resilience in the system. I think that the best way to respond to this is twofold. One is upgrading the competence of the farmers so that farmers have a higher level of productive capabilities to have surpluses. And therefore training farmers, to me, is the first step in being able to deal with the climate change and ecological degradation. So I would strongly advocate that the creation of farm schools so that farmers, whether it's in villages or in larger communities, have schools that train them to be better farmers is the best way to guarantee this resilience. My view is, if you look at the structure of Africa's demographic alignment at the moment, where the majority of the people are basically the youth. If you check to see where they are, you will find out that most of them are in school. So the starting point in engaging the African youth in agriculture and food security is actually through the schools. So I would advocate, for example, the idea that where possible, every school should actually have a farm where the students are not just producing to learn, but they are also producing to sell, so that doing agriculture becomes an integral part of the educational program, because the majority of the population is right now in school. There are communities in Africa, including the community I come from in Western Kenya, where 75% of the population is either in a primary school, high school, or in a polytechnic. So the schools have, for all practical purposes, become the community. And that also means that we need to think differently about the role of teachers, that the teachers are not just classroom teachers, but they also become leaders in their own right. The fact that the youth constitute the largest section of the population means that they need to be in charge of the agricultural agenda, and they need to be empowered. But I think that the way that the youth can be empowered is where agriculture becomes an integral part of the educational system and the curriculum, because the idea of empowerment is really an expression of the competence of the youth, and that is done through them knowing what they are doing. And so I think that agricultural education for the youth is essential. And the second part of the empowerment is where they have the ability to create enterprises, to turn their knowledge into goods and services. And that's, again, something that could be done actually quite easily by connecting, say, financing institutions with the schools, but also changing the curriculum so that young people can start to learn early in school, particularly in the upper part of high school, on how to create enterprises. Other than that, the word empowerment just becomes rhetorical. It has to be backed up by knowledge and funding. When I think of schools, I think of schools as including both men and women. But there is a dimension that is really important, which has to do with the fact that the majority of African farmers are women. And because they are women, there has to be a deliberate effort to create institutions, particularly educational institutions, that specifically target women. And we are already starting to see new universities being created in Africa that are devoted to educating rural women to do agriculture. An example of this is the African Rural University for Women, which is located in Western Uganda, that was created by women to support women, young women in agriculture. It's the first rural university for women in Africa. The interesting thing about it is that it grew out of a proposal by the women themselves to have a university to train them at the university level. And those are the kinds of programs that I would like to see, in fact, being supported. And this university is also interesting because all its support came from an NGO. It didn't come from government. It was initially supported by an NGO. So many of the NGOs that operate in Africa are in fact capable of incubating women's universities and colleges. I think that the empowerment of women to guarantee food security has to be accompanied with improvement in their technical competence. For example, it takes 200 hours for an African woman to weed a hectare of land. Now, by simply changing that and giving them the ability to control weeds using new other technologies like weed control technologies, liberates the women so that they are able to do other productive functions in society. So I see that their role in terms of empowerment has also to do with liberating them from drudgery. And when they are liberated from drudgery, then they can participate in more activities than just doing agriculture. Because I don't think that the purpose of empowerment is to tie the women to the land permanently. It's to actually free them so that they improve their efficiency and are more productive, and that allows them to do other things. And I also think that when agriculture becomes more technically oriented, more men would want to go into agriculture. One of the reasons why African agricultural systems are basically volatile is the inability to predict changes in the environment, very much linked to rainfall. And upgrading the capacity, particularly of governments, to have effective early warning systems could be a very powerful instrument for supporting resilience. And I'll give you an example of something that I'm working on right now with the Kenya government as a response of the famines that have hit East Africa recently. Is that countries that have satellite capability were aware that a drought was coming, but the East Africans didn't have that information. It doesn't cost very much to create, in fact, a regional satellite system that will enable East Africa to have a better understanding and monitoring of ecological change. And when that capacity is in place, then you can connect them to communication with the farmers and pastoralists, where you are able to, in fact, even direct pastoralists to areas that may have pasture because you will have information on where it rained the previous week. So resilience, in my view, is a consequence of running agriculture as a knowledge-intensive activity where you have that command of information. And right now, many African countries don't have that information. The only countries that have space programs are Egypt, Algeria, Nigeria, South Africa, and Angola. And if East Africa is just starting to think about it. In fact, the Kenyan parliament has adopted a resolution to develop a policy and a law to create a satellite system. But that then has to be linked onto ground facilities so that the farmers have access to that information. And I think the best vehicle for doing that is through schools.